Ladies and gentlemen, they have done it again. The Penrith Panthers are premiers for the 4th time in a row. Honestly, as I say that out loud, it still completely blows my mind. I was born in 2002, right? I grew up in an era where teams could not win back-to-back premierships. It was simply regarded as a mountain that couldn't be climbed 2 years in a row. We all felt, psychologically, that the champions could not achieve the same level of hunger to defend their title as other teams could to take it away from them. The hunger to stay champions was substantially less than the hunger to become champions. Now we've got a side who have done it for nearly half a decade, who have cracked the code and somehow maintained the hunger, who have exceeded everything that we thought was possible in the salary cap era. Before I get into the game, for those of you who want to hear my thoughts on the Jack Howarth no try, I have some very strong things to say about that. So much so that it's actually going to be its own video later this week, so definitely keep an eye out for that. It's going to be a lively one. But first, I thought it would be appropriate to give due praise to our 4-time premiers. This is how the Penrith Panthers beat the dominant 2024 Melbourne Storm and etched themselves even deeper into rugby league immortality. In my 2 videos in the lead up to this game, I had a pretty clear idea of how the balance of play was going to unfold. Now, I knew that we were going to see the very best version of the Panthers forward pack on Grand Final night. But what really put the nail in the coffin for me was the suspension of Nelson Asofa-Solomona. I am completely aware that the Storm did beat the Panthers earlier this year without Nelson, but in the context of a grand final, that doesn't even enter into my thinking. Using a round 1 game to try and predict how the grand final is going to play out simply isn't an accurate way to do things. The 2 fixtures are worlds apart, and even the individual players are no longer the same guys that they were back in March. I said that the Panthers forwards were going to dominate. That, paired with the brilliant kicking game of Nathan Cleary, would force the Storm to come out of their own end for the majority of the game. That was proven correct, by 66% of the territory going the way of the Panthers across the 80 minutes. It was even more true in the first half, where the Panthers had a mind-blowing 78% of the territory. Given that Penrith would win the field position battle, I said that Melbourne would be forced into a position that teams generally don't like being in. A position where they have to try and spread the ball out wide and chance their arm out of their own end to try and come up with line breaks and put points on the board. I said that the Panthers were going to try and suffocate the Storm's spine, and it was on those Melbourne spine members to escape that and still make something out of it. But they just couldn't. A side with a spine of Harry Grant, Jerome Hughes, Cameron Munster and Ryan Papenhuyzen were limited to just 2 line breaks for the whole game. 2 line breaks. For context, a week earlier against the Roosters, that same side made 9. For all the analysis you've seen and will continue to see about this game, fundamentally, that's where the grand final was won and lost. It was an extremely simple, defense-oriented game plan from Penrith, and it was essentially impossible to counter. And I do say defense-oriented very intentionally. The Panthers didn't have to do a lot of goal line defense throughout the whole game, but that was as a result of how well they defended Melbourne while the Storm were coming out of their own end. The Penrith attack wasn't crash hot. Particularly in the first half, some of their 5th tackle options were really poor. Even their game-winning try to Paul Alamotti came off a simple effort play from Liam Martin to catch the bomb, and then a diving front rower in Moses Leota looping the ball out wide to try and desperately find his winger. That's off the cuff. You do not set up for those things. If they happen and they work, then that's fantastic, but it is not as a result of you having put in good attacking structures. But the Panthers' defense meant that they could keep the Storm where they wanted them and then capitalize on any half opportunities that presented themselves. And I do want to say credit to the Melbourne Storm. Their goal line defense in this game was absolutely unreal. It was the kind of goal line defense that wins teams premierships. Truthfully, I don't know what Craig Bellamy could have said to his players after the game, because to be honest, with the exception of making 3 more errors than the Panthers did, I don't know if there's much more that his side could have done. If you replayed that game tomorrow, even with the Storm knowing exactly what game plan the Panthers were going to try and implement, I still don't think they'd be able to stop them. At least not without taking substantial risks out of their own end, and there's obviously no guarantee that those are going to pay off. I said that the Panthers were going to try and make the Storm uncomfortable, but I had no idea just the extent to which they were going to do it. There was another factor though that ensured that the Panthers were able to perform the way that they did, and it's one that goes back 4 years to the last time these two sides met in a grand final. It was 2020, and an ultra-young Panthers side had just won the minor premiership by 5 points over the second place Melbourne Storm. They were the dominant side all season, and teams often looked defeated when coming up against them even before the ball had been kicked off. They made their way through the Roosters and the Rabbitohs in the final series before lining up against the Storm in the grand final. It was a game that they were heavily favoured to win, and yet on the night it was the Storm's experience that dominated the arguably more talented young Panthers. Now, despite all the success that the Panthers have had since that grand final loss, it's still a game that gets brought up consistently within the four walls there at Penrith. It's a game and a feeling that they strive to absolutely ensure never happens again. Now, you could play back the last 45 seconds of what I've said. You could switch Panthers with Storm and you get the narrative that played out this season. Think about it, a relatively young Storm side won the minor premiership by 6 points over the second place Panthers. They were the dominant side all season, they made their way through the Sharks and Roosters in the final series and lined up against the Panthers in the grand final. It was a game that they were favoured to win, and yet, on the night, it was the Panthers' experience that dominated the arguably more talented young Storm. That's something that I've got no doubt played a motivating role in the minds of these Panthers players. The core of their squad, Edwards, Leaguie, Cleary and Yeo, were all there on that night. They all felt that pain, as did To'o, Leota, Fisher-Harris and Liam Martin. Now, they would have handled the week professionally. The week would have been about getting out there on Sunday night and implementing the game plan as perfectly as possible. But to some extent, it also would have been about revenge, about finally beating the one demon that these Panthers let themselves get haunted by, and they were never going to let that chance slip away. Now, in particular, I want to put a spotlight on a handful of individual Panthers players. It's not Cleary or Leaguie or Yeo, it's guys like Paul Alamotti, Luke Garner, and hell, even Liam Martin. I'm confident that this side will eventually be remembered as Nathan Cleary and 16 other guys, in the same way that those old Newcastle sides are remembered for Andrew Johns. But this team is about so much more than the individuals. It really is a system. And that system achieves the ultimate goal that any coach seeks to achieve with their squad. It gets the very best out of every single player. Paul Alamotti is a grand final hero. Among other things, he scored the game-winning try and caught the Storm's final bomb, which is what ignited celebrations for the Panthers. Both of which were things he did after shifting out to the other side of the field to cover on the wing for Brian To'o. Compare that to 12 months ago, where he was a player who had had his first grade opportunity at the Bulldogs and couldn't keep his spot. Luke Garner is a player with back-to-back premiership rings, a feat that would have been the furthest thing from his mind when he won the wooden spoon with the West Tigers aged 27. He's transformed from that into an absolutely guaranteed bench selection for the four-time premiers, and the man who starts games when either Liam Martin or Scott Sorensen are injured. And lastly, that man, Liam Martin, the Clive Churchill medalist, one of their 8 players to win 4 premierships. Tell me that he individually becomes the player he is at another club. Other teams are going to catch some strays here, but tell me that he's a guy who has 12 Origin appearances and 6 Australia caps if he comes through the Eels system, or the Dragons system, or the Bulldogs system. I think Martin would be the first guy to say that he owes so much of what he has individually achieved to what the Panthers have done for him. The last thing I want to do is take away from him as a player. He always had the potential there to be harnessed, but he ended up in an organisation that knew exactly how to extract that potential. The Panthers may have won this grand final with their suffocating tactical game plan, but they've won the last 4 grand finals by building a system that gets the very best out of these players every single year. What more can you say about these Penrith Panthers? Year after year, they lose more players. Year after year, people doubt whether they can get up and do it again. And yet, year after year, they do. I completely understand that their dominance is somewhat predictable and boring. As a neutral voice, I get where you're coming from. But in decades to come, we're going to look back on this era fondly. We're going to look back on this team as one of the greatest to ever take to the rugby league field. And we're going to find it really cool that we got to live the story and see it unfold as it was happening. Whether they can do it again next season is another question. And luckily for me, it's one I've got an entire off season to try and figure out. But for now, I'm just going to sit back and appreciate what these Panthers have been able to do. Stay tuned for the Jack Howarth no try video because I'm going to be lighting some fires. But until then, thanks for watching and I'll see you later.